Hey there, Bandits here, welcome to another Path of Exile guide, this time with a Poisonous Concoction champion. So far, my favorite build of the league. If you've played Legendary Gladiator in the past, this is probably the closest we can now get to the same level of defense while having much better damage output. So, as usual, defense and survivability, mapping and clearing speed, bossing, and single target damage, cost, and viability as a league starter are the categories I'm rating my builds on. Now, of course, there's no method to this, these are just my personal ratings based on my experience with the build and other builds in the past. In that context, yours might be slightly different, so do take these with a grain of salt and use them just as a rough guideline rather than being a very strict tiering list. Now, tankiness is definitely where this build truly shines, with a shit ton of armor and evasion, a very high chance to suppress spells, even capped with a bit of investment, excellent flash sustain, even during boss fights you should manage to keep them up almost permanently, and amazing life leech that you're basically gonna refill your life just hitting an enemy once or twice, as well as stun immunity. We also have permanent fortify, which is actually very hard to come by nowadays, reducing all damage you take by 20%, and another 10% less damage taken from all sources as a bonus from your Ascendancy. Add to that the absolutely mind-blowing Molten Shell buffs, which absorb anywhere between 5 to 9, 10k damage based on how much armor you have, and the fact that enemies you poison, meaning any enemy you hit, cannot deal critical strikes, which means this nullifies some of the most dangerous map modes out there, like the crit multiplier. Enemies have power charges, that kind of stuff gets completely nullified by this, and prevents high spikes of damage. Now, speaking of mapping, you can pretty much run any map modes, probably with the exception of no leech, because you kind of rely on leech to keep your mana sustained. And no regen is kind of a pain. I usually skip those. You can bypass no regen by using an enduring mana flask, but apart from that, everything else is fair game, even all forms of reflect. Clearing is actually very decent for this build, especially once you get the cluster jewel with the unspeakable gifts passive for the chaos explosions. Now, this is obviously not a zoomy raider or custom crit I need to sell a kidney to gear up for type of build, so you shouldn't expect to perform at that level. Now, all in all, what you see in this video has cost me about 10x, close to the beginning of the league when prices are quite higher. Now, obviously, prices in Path of Exile can vary very rapidly and wildly, even day by day, and buying stuff off the market and crafting gear is kind of an art form in itself, so your own millage may vary. However, I did my best to put this build together without relying on any fancy or hard to get uniques or expensive stuff. It's mostly just rares, and rares that are quite common on the marketplace and rares that are easy to craft. Now, bossing is clearly the weak point of this build. It's a Achilles heel, if you wish. Mostly due to the design of the skill and how poison works against bosses. I'll go over that a bit later in the build overview section. Now, this doesn't mean you cannot kill bosses. You can actually do that very reliably, but it will be slower than usual. On the other hand, because you are so tanky and because you have such amazing flash sustain, boss fights are actually quite easy. Sure, they will take longer, but making mistakes does not automatically mean you lose a portal like with most other builds. So with a bit of patience, this build is amazing if you're a beginner or a new player, because it allows you to learn the fights and practice harder boss fights. And finally, Poisonous Concoction is an extremely good league starter. The early damage, the clearing, the smoothness of the gameplay are absolutely top tier, without requiring any specific gear or uniques. In fact, many speed racers nowadays are switching to Poisonous Concoction to try to beat older records. Okay, so now you know what you're getting. Let's talk about how everything works, and there are a few interesting things we need to clarify about your main skill, Poisonous Concoction. So by default, it throws a bottle of poison which hits enemies and deals damage in an area around the spot it lands on, and has a chance to apply a poison stack on any enemy it hits. Now, Poisonous Concoction can only be used unarmed, so you cannot have a weapon equipped in your main hand. However, you can still use a shield, and this is exactly what we're gonna do with this build as well. If you have a life flask that isn't empty, Poisonous Concoction will use 2 charges from that flask to gain a massive damage increase bonus, and that bonus is based on the total life recovery number that's written on the flask, and the highest amount you can get is from a saturated divine life flask. Now, if you have multiple life flasks, Poisonous Concoction will not use charges from all of them at the same time, so you cannot artificially increase your damage that way. However, if your first flask, if one of the flasks is empty and you have another life flask, then Poisonous Concoction will start using charges from that second life flask to keep getting the damage bonus, and in the meantime, you know, the first flask can start recharging as well. And this is why generally I recommend replacing the Quicksilver flask, the movement flask, with a second life flask in any tough boss fight. Now, the poison part is the main focus of the build, while the on-hit component of the skill is basically just a vehicle for applying the poison stacks and other on-hit effects like life leech, mana leech, life gain on hit, mana gain on hit, or applying a curse. For this reason, we're not really concerned about stuff like attack damage or projectile damage, which would only affect the on-hit part and not the poison stacks. However, we absolutely need to have 100% chance to hit, because missing an attack means that particular attack will not apply a poison stack, so that is a direct DPS loss, which is why accuracy is very important. The same goes for chance to poison. By default, the skill only has 40% chance to poison on hit. We get another 55 from the passive tree and another 5 from a jewel. So poison's where the real damage is, and we scale that first and foremost by increasing the base damage, which, apart from the flask thing I mentioned earlier, comes from any source of flat physical and flat chaos damage. Then we stack stuff like damage over time multiplier, increased poison damage, increased poison duration, increased chaos damage, because ultimately poisons are a specific type of dot dealing chaos damage over time. Now, one incredibly important thing to keep in mind about poisons is that theoretically there isn't any cap, any limit to how many poisons you can stack on a single enemy, and each poison stack deals damage independently to other poison stacks. So if you can apply 5 poison stacks instead of a single poison stack, then you will have 5 times more DPS. This in turn means that increasing, for example, your attack speed directly impacts your DPS, directly increases your DPS, because you can apply more poison stacks in the exact same amount of time. Even better, Poisonous Concoction can actually shotgun enemies by increasing the number of projectiles. So by default you fire 1 projectile. Then if we add greater multiple projectiles, we end up with 5 projectiles. However, they're quite a bit spread apart. Maybe 2 or 3 of them overlap and can shotgun. But then we add greater volley support, which narrows down, adds another 4 projectiles, so we end up with 9, and narrows them down, having the projectiles fly in parallel to each other. So that means it's much more likely to shotgun, especially large targets like bosses. The final piece of this puzzle is to get as much increased area of effect as possible, which, well, increases the area of effect of each Poisonous Concoction projectile. In fact, with enough sources of increased area of effect, you can have all 9 projectiles overlap and shotgun enemies. So practically each time you attack, you will apply 9 poison stacks on larger targets such as bosses, so dealing 9 times more damage. You can get increased area of effect from the quality on the Poisonous Concoction gem itself, using an alternate quality anomalous void manipulation jewel, by having the helmet enchant for Poisonous Concoction, which increases the area of effect, and by crafting increased area of effect with your hideout crafting bench on helmet, gloves, and maybe even amulet. So you don't need all of these. However, stacking as much as possible will directly increase your damage, your DPS. Another issue that the build needed to address was mana sustain, and early on during the campaign and maybe even early Atlas, you should be using a low level clarity aura. Don't activate all the other auras, maybe just Herald of Agony for example, and definitely get an enduring mana flask, which is an amazing tool for this, for sustaining mana, which is practically free. Clever Thief passive will further help with the mana sustain, and later on crafting non-channeling skills have minus mana cost on rings and amulet will definitely help with this as well. For higher budgets and endgame min-maxing, you can also get a Watcher's Eye with non-channeling skills have -9 mana cost while affected by Clarity, and using an anomalous greater multiple projectiles support will even further reduce the cost. Now you can of course combine some of these, or not necessarily all of them, just enough to get the mana cost somewhere between 20 and 30 mana. That should be enough, that the cost should be low enough so you can sustain it while in combat and having all the auras activated. Okay, so that's kind of all you need to know about the skills mechanics. I'll go over the rest of the abilities a bit later in the guide, but for now let's just talk about the passive tree and how you level up this bad boy. So you start off as a duelist, and up to level 12 when you get Poisonous Concoction you can use Splitting Steel or basically any other melee skill you fancy. It makes very little difference at those early levels. Once you do get Poisonous Concoction, link it with volley support and chance to poison on hit, drop your weapon and grab a shield for some extra defense, and you can also find additional leveling setups in the POB in the skills tab. Now if this is not your first character of the league and you can afford buying some of the fancy leveling uniques, then I recommend grabbing a Mutwind Pennant Shield and combine that with an Enduring Cry Warcry. Add a Thieves Torment Ring or 2 Praxis Rings to take care of all your mana issues, and a Gold Dream, the classic Gold Dream helmet for the massive resistances bonuses. Also get a pair of Dusk Toe Boots, Nocturnal Caress gloves, a Carnish Heart amulet, and maybe a Tabula Rasa. However, with Tabula I don't recommend going over 4 or 5 links, like not using the full 6 links because the mana cost will be too high to sustain. Finally, here's the passive tree and the order for picking the notable passives. As always, in the POB, in the tree tab, you'll find the passives broken down act by act and by level brackets, including masteries. Now the build also uses a cluster jewel, but I did include a non-cluster variant in the POB as well. The main reason we want a cluster jewel is for the Unspeakable Gifts notable passive, which gives a 10% chance for enemies you kill to explode, dealing damage in an area around them, greatly helping with clearing. Other good passives here are Touch of Cruelty, Unholy Grace, Wicked Pole, or Unwaveringly Evil. Now early on it's perfectly fine to go with a cluster jewel that only has 2 passives, Unspeakable Gift and any other of the ones I've mentioned, and later on upgrade to a cluster jewel with 3 passives. And I've obviously included trade links for the cluster jewels in the notes tab of the POB. One last thing about the passive tree, you have the option of using a Brutal Restraint Timeless Jewel, and you can place that in a jewel socket either above Herbalism or the one above Charisma. And a Brutal Restraint Timeless Jewel adds Dexterity to all the small nodes in its radius and additional bonuses on any notable passive in its radius. And this is very valuable for 2 main reasons. First, by having extra Dexterity you get increased chance to suppress spell damage thanks to the Magebane passive, and your chance to hit is also increased thanks to the Mastery bonus from the Acuity wheel. So you get extra accuracy. On top of that, some of the bonuses added by Brutal Restraint on notable passives can be very valuable for this build. So you can get stuff like attack speed, evasion, accuracy, resistances, maximum life, even flask or poison related affixes or bonuses rather. The exact extra bonuses you'll get on the notable passives are random, and they are based on the number or seed that is written in the jewel's description. However, nobody knows all the possible combinations because there are thousands and thousands of them, so they are for all intents and purposes random. However, you can re-roll any timeless jewel, including Brutal Restraint, using a Divine Orb to hopefully get better bonuses if the current ones you have are useless. You can also try moving the gem from between the 2 sockets I've mentioned, because you'll get different bonuses in the 2 places. Finally, for the Bandits quest you get in Act 2, just kill them all and get the 2 passive points. None of their bonuses are any useful for this build, and there's plenty of great stuff to be had on the passive tree. Moving on to Pantheons, the choices here are pretty straightforward and simple. For the Major God, go with Soul of the Brine King and upgrade its powers as soon as possible for the freeze immunity and reduced effect of chill, Soul of the Brine King is at the moment pretty much hands down the best major god power for any build that is not elemental ailment immune. Now for the minor god, go with Soul of Rislatha for Flask charges recovery. Now considering that Poisonous Concoction is gobbling up those charges to get the damage bonus, you know, any extra amount of Flask charges recovery is more than welcome, and getting that from the Pantheon is a very cheap and easy way to do it. For the Ascendancy, I decided to go with a champion over the more common and more obvious Pathfinder for a couple of reasons. The only things that a Pathfinder brings to the table is increased area of effect, flash sustain, and a bit of extra DPS. Now all these are actually quite easy to get nowadays on the passive tree or crafting using the crafting bench. However, the amount of defense a champion Ascendancy provides is pretty much impossible for the Pathfinder to achieve without, I don't know, dropping all the points into defensive things on the tree, which would then mean its DPS would be dogshit. So otherwise put, the champion is able to get pretty much close to the same amount of DPS as a Pathfinder and flash sustain, while a Pathfinder cannot really or realistically get with the same budget the same amount of defense and the same amount of DPS and flash sustain as a champion. So this might change in future patches, but you know, as it stands right now, these are the numbers, so this is what I went with. And you know, defense is king in Path of Exile. Anyway, the first points go into Unstoppable Hero for a large amount of base, flat armor and evasion, attack speed, stun immunity, and extra damage, while you have Fortification, or the way we used to know it, the Fortify buff. However, alone this passive is pretty much useless, as we don't really have a reliable way of getting Fortification from gems or gear or passives. However, the second Ascendancy, Fortitude, provides just that, 20 stacks of Fortification. Now, apart from enabling the previous passive and all its bonuses, Fortification grants like 20 stacks of Fortification translates into 20% less damage taken from hits, which is a gigantic amount, you know, by today's standards and the current state of the game. Follow this up with Inspirational, which increases the effect of your auras, namely Grace, Determination, Malevolence, and it allows you to use a banner for free without any mana reservation cost, and we'll be using the Defiance banner, which all in all these will translate into a slight increase in DPS from Malevolence and about 20,000 armor and evasion from the other auras, which is again a huge amount of extra defense for a single Ascendancy passive. And finally, the last passive, Conqueror, will allow you to taunt enemies on hit, 100% chance to taunt enemies on hit, and taunted enemies will deal 10% less damage overall with hits, with dots and everything. So it's a generic 10% damage reduction across the board. And with that, let's move on to probably the most important part of any build, gems and links. Now, the numbers you'll see listed for each gem are the gem level and quality, and in some situations we actually don't need to level up, or it's better to not level up a gem to max, so I'll list that accordingly. And for some gems, quality might be useless for this particular build, so you'll see that listed as 0. Also for the 6 link setup, I'm listing the gems in order of their importance, so if you can only get a 5 link, just drop the last gem I'm listing. So let's start with the main setup. Poisonous Concoction, linked with a Greater Volley, Greater Multiple Projectiles, Void Manipulation, Vicious Projectiles, and Unbound Ailments. I've explained earlier in the build overview section why we're going with Volley and GMP, so you know, check that out if you skipped it. The rest of the supports simply increase damage over time, chaos damage, or the duration of poison stacks, so you know, in the end more DPS, nothing really complicated. And just as a side note, while Deadly Ailments support would have been a better 5th or 6th gem from a pure DPS perspective, it would have also gutted our own hit damage, and that in turn would have meant much less life leech and mana leech. So for this reason, no, we're not taking Deadly Ailments. Next setup is the Wither debuff applying machine, made out of Ancestral Protector totem, multiple totems, faster attacks, and Withering Touch support. Now, Wither is a debuff that drastically increases the chaos damage taken by affected enemies, and it can stack up to 15 times. Now, with 3 totems and 0.2 seconds attack speed, on top of the Wither stacks we apply with Withering Step, it should be easy to reach that 15 stacks on most enemies. Now, on top of that, the Ancestral Protector totem actually provides a massive attack speed buff while you're near any of those totems, which in turn means you get to apply more poison stacks, and that is more DPS. Now, I only use this setup in tough boss fights or other fixed combat scenarios, you know, like Delve, Rituals, Metamorphs, Blight, stuff like that. You don't really need to use it while mapping, it would be quite cumbersome anyway. You can also replace this setup with a spell totem setup with a Wither spell, which has the advantage of casting the spell at a range, so it has a better, it's a bit better at applying the 15 Wither stacks. However, it does require a lot more int, and that's kind of hard to squeeze in, and at the same time you are losing the attack speed buff from Ancestral Protector. So, you know, experiment, see which one works better for you. You know, it also greatly depends on how good you are at placing your totems so they don't get destroyed, and the Ancestral Protector totems are always in range of the boss, so that kind of requires you to know and understand each boss fight so you can place your totems accordingly. Then we have an aura setup made out of Determination, Val Grace, and Malevolence, and the only way you can fit all these 3 auras is if you socket them into a shield that has the mod Socketed Gems have 30% increased reservation efficiency, which again reduces the amount of mana they reserve. Now, until you get such a shield, replace Malevolence with Herald of Agony. Also keep in mind that Val Grace, as any other Val skill in the game, has 2 different components: the regular Grace, which is the aura, the permanent buff part, and the Val Grace, which is a temporary buff which you can activate and increases your evasion by quite a large amount, and the effect of spell suppression. Now, you can use this as, you know, your oh shit button when a giant pile of turds hits the proverbial fan. Next, we have a few utility skills. First, Withering Step, which by default applies 6 stacks of the Wither debuff I've mentioned earlier to all enemies in its radius, and it also provides an elusive buff as well as phasing. Elusive increases your chance to avoid attacks, phasing allows you to pass through enemies. However, in practice we only really care about the Wither debuff application, so you know, make sure to actually spam this ability on cooldown, especially in boss fights. Then you have the very interesting Plague Bearer, which has 2 modes you can toggle between: incubating and infecting. While incubating, it will store a part of a portion of your poison damage for later use, and you can release that damage while, you know, toggling the skill again in infecting mode, and that creates a sort of aura around you that deals poison damage to all enemies around you. And it's actually very useful, you know, while mapping, because you can very quickly get all the damage stockpiled, let's say, incubated. It can store up to 1 million damage by default, and then release it. And when you pair that with Unspeakable Gifts, the explosion passive from the Cluster Jewel, you know, most enemies will instantly melt and explode and, you know, trigger this cascade effect, this chain reaction. So yeah, don't worry too much about optimizing it or using it, you know, perfectly. Just trigger it whenever you remember, and it should be fine. Now, the third gem is a Molten Shell, which creates a damage absorption shield based on your armor, and I was kind of constantly having anywhere between 5k to 10k damage absorption shields, which is ridiculous. And the way I use this is I placed it on my left mouse button instead of the default move or attack action, so it got cast on cooldown without interrupting movement and without me having to actively managing it in any way. Finally, add Defiance Banner, which should have 0 reservation cost after you've taken the inspirational passive from the Ascendancy, And if you've crafted the increased AoE on either your gloves or your helmet, then you should definitely socket this gem setup in either of those pieces of gear, because the same mod also grants +1 level to socketed AoE gems, and all these gems, all these 4 gems have the AoE tag. This means Withering Step will apply 7 stacks of Withered instead of 6. Plague Bearer will stockpile up to 1.2 million, I think, damage instead of the default 1 million and release that while infecting. Molten Shell will absorb more damage, and the bonuses of evasion and armor of Defiance banner will increase as well. So do make sure you socket this setup in one of the gear pieces where you have +1 level to AoE gems. And finally, the last setup is a bit more flexible. First you have your mobility skill, which can either be dash plus second wind or shield charge plus faster attacks. Now, neither of these are perfect, they're both pretty crap, and especially since dash actually shares a cooldown with Withering Step, because they're both blink skills for whatever reason. However, there aren't that many mobility skills that can be used while unarmed. For whatever reason, GG didn't think this through, and most mobility skills actually require a weapon. Now experiment with both variants, see whichever you prefer and which is both the best suited for your playstyle. And no, Flame Dash isn't better, because beyond the first cast its speed is proportional with cast speed, and this build doesn't really have any, and it also requires quite a bit of int, again quite problematic. For the last 2 gems I went with a low level Clarity Aura linked with Arrogance, so it gets reserved from your life pool instead of your mana pool, because we don't really have a lot of mana left. Clarity provides a decent amount of mana regen and also enables some very interesting Watcher's Eye mods like the minus mana one. You can however go with Vitality or Precision, again low level Vitality or Precision auras like level 3 or something like that, and instead of Clarity. Okay, so now let's talk a bit about gearing. First, you'll find trade links in the POB in the notes tab, and generally I'll list 3 tiers: basic, mid tier and best in slot, which have the performance and price tag increase with each tier. However, if 2 tiers are very close together, then I'll probably just combine them. There are overall a few major goals you have for the build when it comes to gearing up. First, the obvious, get your elemental resistances capped, and then actually try do your best to get chaos resistance at least as close as possible to be capped. And this is not only for defense, it's not just a matter of being more tanky, but chaos resistance also increases your damage through the mastery from the wasting passive wheel. Now, the second very important goal for gearing is getting your chance to hit to 100% through accuracy and dexterity. Whenever you miss an attack, you won't apply a poison stack, and that directly lowers and impacts your DPS. The third priority is getting as much increased area of effect as possible, and you can craft that using your hideout crafting bench on your helmet, gloves and amulet. As long as those items have an empty prefix. And lastly, whenever possible, do try on your helmet, gloves, body armor if you go with a rare one, and boots, try to get hybrid armor plus evasion bases. This didn't used to be very important in the past, but now it is, and especially for this particular build. So starting from the top, on helmets you're looking for maximum life, accuracy and an empty prefix where you can craft the increased area of effect. Any extra resistances, strength or maybe dex here are more than welcome. Now for the best in slot, you're looking for a hunter influenced item with a mod nearby enemies have -9 to chaos resistance. And you can try crafting that yourself on a hunter influenced helmet that has an item level 85, at least 85. And you can do that with chaos harvest recipes or with fossil crafting using aberrant fossils. Now for the enchant, the absolute best you can get is increased poison's concoction area of effect, and the second best would be withering step applies 3 additional withered debuffs. Everything else, any other enchants, are kind of equal. as long as they affect one of your skills. For the weapon, well, we're not using any, so you know, saving up a bit of currency there. However, in the offhand, you'll be using a shield, and you need one with the mod Socketed Gems have 30% increased reservation efficiency, which will allow you to activate all the auras. Do keep in mind you have to socket the auras in the shield. Apart from that, get some maximum life and some chance to suppress spell damage. Now, chance to suppress spell damage can be found both as an affix on the shield and can roll up to 20%, and it can also roll as an implicit on spiked shield bases. Apart from that, mods like resistances, accuracy, attack speed, maximum resistances, you know, are more than welcome as secondary mods on this slot. Next, on the body armor, initially you can go with a rare one with a 5 or 6 link with, I don't know, 80-90 maximum life and resistances, both elemental and chaos, ideally on an evasion / armor base. Maybe even get some chance to suppress spell damage here as well. Now, for the best in slot, I think the most balanced and optimal choice here, both from what you get out of it and the price perspective, Cherubim's Maleficence is pretty much your best choice. You get a shit ton of armor and evasion, you get increased chaos damage, which is something you're not normally getting on a body armor, and a bit of maximum life. I mean, a decent amount of maximum life, and basically doubling your life leech effectiveness. So nothing is really wasted on this body armor, and it's a very common and usually very cheap unique. Sure, something like replica Pharaoh's Fur, for example, would be much better overall. However, it would also cost 2 times more than the entire build put together. So, you know, if you can afford something like that, go for it. But, you know, for the vast majority of players, Cherubim's Maleficence is actually a very decent option. Moving on to gloves, this is a gear slot where you want to stack up as much damage as possible, and ideally you want a Hunter or Elder influence based with a Chaos damage over time multiplier mod, attack speed, maximum life, and the crafted increased area of effect that you can craft with your hideout crafting bench. Now, similar to the helmet, you can craft something like this using Harvest Chaos recipes or Aberrant Fossils, getting some extra stuff like accuracy or dex, strength, flat physical damage, resistances, you know, are more than welcome and excellent bonuses on this gear slot. Next up, boots, maximum life 25 to 30, movement speed, as well as a metric ton of resistances. This is the gear slot where you'll get most of your resistances, and you can actually get more than 100 on a pair of two-toned boots. Now, if you somehow manage to get enough resistance to cap your enough resistances here to get capped while using only 2 suffixes, then the third suffix on the boots can be something like chance to suppress spell damage, which can naturally roll up to 22%, which is a huge amount, or you can craft up to 8% using your hideout crafting bench. Moving on to your belt, similar to boots, this is a slot where you want to stack up as much maximum life and resistances as possible, including chaos resistance. Some extra stuff like flat armor or evasion, or flask related mods such as increased effect of flasks on you, or a chance for flasks to not consume charges when used, are excellent secondary mods here. And ideally you want all that on a Stygian Vice base belt for the extra Abyssal Socket implicit. Then we have the Amulet, which is once more one of those gear slots where you want as much DPS as possible, kind of similar to gloves. And the goal here is to use once more an Hunter influenced Amulet with the mod +1 to level of all Chaos skill gems, which doesn't impact only Poisonous Concoction, but also stuff like Withering Step or Plague Bearer. It gives them an extra level as well. Then, if possible, squeeze in a mod such as increased Chaos damage over time multiplier and some maximum life. Anything else on top of that, you know, resistances, accuracy, the usual, are obviously, you know, more than welcome bonuses, but do try at least to get some int or strength or both from the implicit. Most amulets, you know, will provide attributes as an implicit, so you don't want to get something like just dex because you have plenty of that and you will need int or strength. Now, amulets can be anointed by talking with the NPC Cassia and using oils dropped from blight encounters to add a notable passive to your amulet, any passive from the passive tree. And for this particular build, the best choice is likely Heart of Darkness for a whole bunch of chaos damage and chaos resistance penetration. Now, theoretically, at least on paper, Corruption would probably be a better DPS choice. However, it does require you to be very on the ball with applying wither stacks, and if you're not, you know, consistently applying 15 wither stacks on enemies, then Heart of Darkness is a better choice. And if for some strange reason you feel like you need more defense, probably something like Entrench would be your best choice there. For both your rings, the top priority is getting the non-channeling skills have minus mana cost mod on both of them. This will allow you to spam Poisonous Concoction without relying on a mana flask or holding off from activating all your auras. Now, the minus mana mod is a prefix and can be crafted using your hideout crafting bench, and you unlock the recipe by unveiling rings or amulets dropped by the syndicate member Elrion. Or, you know, you can maybe have a friend craft that for you that already has that recipe. Or you can just buy the rings with this mod already crafted on them. It's a very popular and, you know, broadly used mod on rings, so you should be able to find quite a few on the market as well. Apart from that, on one of the rings, you'll want the mod Curse enemies on hit with Despair, with the Despair curse, which will massively increase your DPS. For the rest of the affixes, you know the drill: maximum life, resistances, accuracy, maybe a bit of dex. Rings are also one of the best slots where you can get any leftover int or strength that you would need, and it shouldn't be very expensive to do that either. Now, if you do have an empty prefix on a ring and you didn't have to craft the minus mana mod, then you can use your hideout crafting bench to craft flat chaos damage to attacks. That's a very solid DPS mod you can get. Next up, jewels. I did cover the cluster jewel you need for this build in the passive tree section, so check that out if you skipped it. The same goes for the Brutal Restraint Timeless Jewel, where you can grab any of the 3 different types or flavors of Brutal Restraint. It doesn't really make any difference because we're not taking the keystone, so any Brutal Restraint will be just fine for this build. Now, ideally, you should also go with a Watcher's Eye unique jewel that has at least one mod affecting one of your auras, so Clarity, Malevolence, Determination, or Grace. You can obviously, you know, combine mods for these auras and try to get one with at least 2 of them. It can be a bit expensive, but definitely totally worth it. Now, I can't list all the possible combinations here, but you will have the trade link in the notes tab of the POB. On rare jewels, you'll want the usual. You'll want life, increased attack speed, chaos damage over time multiplier, damage over time multiplier, increased chaos damage, increased poison damage, poison duration, chance to poison on hit, accuracy, that kind of stuff. And last but definitely not least, the flasks. You'll obviously need a life flask, and not just, you know, because it will keep you alive and recover your HP, but the Poisonous Concoction skill relies on life flasks to get a massive damage bonus. So the aim here is to get the highest possible number for the life recovery that's written on the flask, and the best combo for that is getting a saturated divine life flask. And you can either buy a flask like that or try crafting one yourself using alteration orbs, but do keep in mind you will need a divine life flask that has at least an item level 81 for the saturated mod to be able to roll. Otherwise, you can settle for the second tier, for the second best, which is concentrated. For the suffix, you want bleed immunity, and once again there are several tiers here, and the best ones being assuaging or allaying. For the rest of the flasks, you have 4 different, let's say, suffixes that you're looking for: attack speed, evasion, life leech, and reduced effect of curses. Now, it doesn't really matter what suffix you get on which flask, so it doesn't matter if you get, let's say, attack speed on your granite flask or the silver flask. It's already very hard to get the high tier mods, so you know, having them paired to specific flasks would be very hard to obtain. So you're looking for ample or chemist as a prefix, sulfur, granite, stibnite, and silver flasks, with each of them with one of the suffixes I've mentioned earlier. Now, if you feel like your movement speed is too low, you can replace the stibnite flask with a quicksilver flask with one of the suffixes I mentioned, and during tougher boss fights you can drop that and replace it with a second life flask if you notice that in boss fights you end up with no charges in your life flask, although that shouldn't be the case.
Learn anything new, Exile?
If you did learn anything from this guide, even if you just want to steal an idea for your own build, then my job here is done, and I would definitely not mind at all if you liked the video or wrote some fancy words, even if it's just to tell me the guide sucks. And if you subscribe, I'll name my next character after you. I won't, but I still greatly appreciate it, and it does help more than you might think. Thank you all for watching, and see ya next time.